I Was the Railroad Killer's One Who Got Away by Whitney Catt. I was 19, staying late at the college darkroom to develop some film for my photography class. The photography building, which was once a tobacco warehouse, was dark and rickety near some lonely railroad tracks in a little travelled part of campus. I finished developing my film close to midnight and headed out, nervous as always to be alone at night in this deserted part of town. Now it was very dark, as several of the streetlights around the parking lot were out, and the few that remained were pointing inwards and put out a very weak flickery light that did nothing to assure me as I headed towards my car. I then heard him before I saw him, a scrape of feet on asphalt. He said, "Hey, can you do me a favour?" I startled and dropped my keys, and he mumbled an apology for scaring me. I noticed he was wearing a jogging suit and limping. "Yeah, what do you need?" I said. He hobbled a step or two towards me. "I think I sprained my ankle. Could you take me to the ER?" Now, the university hospital was a short distance down the road. I hesitated. The guy looked perfectly pleasant though, and he did seem to be in a fair bit of pain, but I'd recently finished a book about a serial killer called Ted Bundy, who lured some of his victims by pretending that he had a broken arm and asking them to help carry books to his car. When they leaned over to put his stuff in the passenger seat of his VW Bug, he would knock them unconscious with a crowbar stuffed inside. This scene played across my mind as I looked at this guy. It also occurred to me to wonder why the hell would anybody go to jog in this creepy part of town. "I'm sorry, I can't do that for you, but I could call you somebody. There's a phone in the photography building there." "There's nobody to call. I just moved here. I don't really know anybody. Can you just drive me? It's right downtown." He then leaned against a car and really winced as he went down to go and rub his ankle. "I'll call you an ambulance," I offered. No, I can't afford that. I don't have health insurance. Just drive me, please. I'll pay you $20. There was something in the way that he said that last bit. Something wrong. Like that exercise in my acting class where we had to recite "Mary Had a Little Lamb," as though we were delivering a tragic monologue or a furious rant, kind of both contradicting each other. There was a tone rising up that I didn't quite match the words he was saying with, a raw urgency that reached down inside me and hit the panic button hard. There was a moment of silence between us. "I can't help you," I said. "I'm leaving." I gripped my keys, slipping them between my fingers the way my mum had taught me, so I could use them as a weapon if I needed to. I kept my eyes on him as I walked towards the last few feet towards my car. I watched as he saw me drive away, still leaning against that car, this time with a very flat expression on his face, away from the dark parking lot. With my music cranked all the way up, driving through campus, my fear faded. I started to feel a little guilty for leaving this guy actually, although I knew I'd done exactly what my mum and dad would have wanted me to. I was about to turn into my dorm parking lot when I realised that I needed to pick up some stuff for breakfast the next morning, so I turned around and headed back to the direction that I'd come from. Then, about a minute down the road, my stomach clenched. There was a guy in the jogging suit running along the sidewalk. His ankles were perfectly fine. Later that summer, 2 students at my college were attacked by those exact same railroad tracks. The girl survived, but her boyfriend didn't. The man who attacked them was a serial killer dubbed the Railroad Killer by the police. He murdered dozens of people across several states, mostly near railroad tracks. I didn't see his mugshot on TV until years later, but the picture broke me out in the same icy sweat I felt when I saw that guy running down the street. Now, I can't be 100% positive, but my gut tells me that I escaped a serial killer that night. I worked with a serial killer by CC109. At the time of these events, I was a 22-year-old female and I just graduated culinary school. I needed the job and I didn't want to remain in the city that I'd finished school in. I had a relative that worked in the administration area of the state prison located in my hometown. Now, due to the nature of this place and me not being entirely sure what the rules are for identifying some people and places, I'm gonna have to be vague in all of my descriptions. I apologise for that. I will say though that originally the prison was designed for higher security inmates, but due to lack of other facilities in the state, the population ended up being a mix of high and low security guys. My relative told me there was an opening in the food production area of the pen as a supervisor. It paid well and had some benefits, and it would look really good on a resume. I interviewed for the position and got hired, and moved back to my hometown. I was pretty much just thrown into the job and spent my first couple of months before and during training. I had to do the same training that COs did and other officers. The worst part of it all was searching through cells. That was awful. So I worked in the main facility, supervising the inmates in the chow hall, escorting them by myself between the areas of the facility to deliver them to pick up chow carts. Just to be clear, in this place you always are on camera. You have a radio on your belt and a panic button and all other sorts of security. It was still kinda creepy though. Once I finished training, I moved over to a separate facility where the actual cooking and production was done. Now food was trucked between it and the main facility at meal times. Inmates and workers were also transported between the two simultaneously. So as I arrived at this place, I started hearing about B. B was a senior guy in the facility amongst the other inmates. He was actually a serial killer. At the time, he was in a different state though, facing charges because the authorities believed that he was responsible for several more remains that were found. Needless to say, it really interested me. So, about a month later, B comes back. I will never forget meeting him for the first time. He's huge. He's 6'5" and 300 pounds, but not even fat. He had gigantic hands and feet and ice blue eyes. He was also extremely quiet, polite and a very hard worker. He was kind of my right hand man, as he got very familiar with the facility and had been working in the kitchen for years. Most of the guys I worked with were fine and most liked me, as A, a young girl, and B, I made the food taste good. So there were some guys that were in there because of things like drug offences and lifers that just wanted to keep their noses clean and live with as little hassle as possible with as much freedom as they could get. And there was general low threat guys. There were still definitely creeps though, but that's the name of the game I guess. I never really felt threatened, especially after one afternoon working with B. Another inmate jokingly come up behind me and said boo, laughing at me saying how he had got me. He then went on his merry way, and B caught up to me. He had a very serious look on his face and said, "If anything ever happens or anyone ever messes with you, you come find me, I'll take care of it." I was a bit taken back by this, but I hated to say this, but it flattered me at the same time. No one messed with B, and most seemed almost in awe of this guy. Some of the stories they told me about him were nuts, so yeah, it felt kinda good to know that he was actually on my side, I guess. So after that, I never felt scared or threatened by B. Until one day, a bit later though. Me and B were setting up the conveyor belts in the area that we used to fill and load the chow trays for the other facilities. We were loading big trays of this stuff into a cart when this little idiot called Skeeter started giving me crap. He had only been in the kitchen for a few weeks and he'd been a total creep and jerk to me literally from the second he showed up. I don't remember exactly what he was saying to me, but I was getting annoyed and flustered. B was bent over placing a tray on the cart when he suddenly stopped, looked up at Skeeter and said in a low voice almost under his breath, "Don't you start anything, Skeeter." I don't know what it was about how quickly and drastically his demeanour changed, but I unconsciously took a step back. Those crazy blue eyes were just focused on Skeeter, and the tone of his voice was so serious and sinister, it scared the life out of me. Even though Skeeter was a little further away, and I don't think he even heard what B said, he knew something was up too. He went all white. He mumbled an apology and hurried off. I was still pulled back, staring at B with my mouth open, and just like that, he straightened up, had a smile on his face and said something along the lines of, "Now that's done, what's next?" And we just went about our day. I ended up quitting not long after that. Working in prison is a rough job, especially for a female of my age. All of the other inmates had told me B was a fantastic artist, and at the time I left, I was told he was actually working on a drawing of me. I never got it, and that kind of bums me out. I will never ever forget that day though. My whole time working there was crazy, but that experience with B was the craziest by far. Encounter with an infamous serial killer by That's a Paddlin'. In the late 70s, my uncle was studying medicine at the University of Chicago. After a morning class, he decided that he would hitchhike back home to Lincoln Park on the north side instead of pay for a taxi. A man then drove up in a Plymouth Satellite and offered my uncle a ride. The man looked normal enough though, and seemed friendly. Light-hearted even. So my uncle got in the car and they started driving towards Lake Shore Drive. However, once they got there, the man drove south on the lake instead of north towards Lincoln Park. My uncle told the man he was going the wrong way and to turn around and head north. The man then looked at my uncle and put his hand on his knee and said, "No son, you're gonna come with me," and smiled darkly at him. My uncle then froze in fear, and when they hit some traffic near the South Shore, he quickly unlocked the passenger side door and ran away without even looking back. A year or two later, on a cold December day, my uncle was having coffee in a cafe with my future aunt when he caught something on TV that literally made his blood run cold. He saw the man that had picked him up from school that day that year before, and he had been arrested for the suspected rape and killing of over 20 young men and boys. The man on the television was John Wayne Gacy, and he even removed the door handle off the passenger side door to prevent anybody from escaping that he picked up. I dropped a serial killer off at home multiple times by Silky Woods. So here's some backstory. In 2003, I was a 16-year-old employee at an urban clothing store here in the south side of Chicago. At the time, I had a manager who was in his early 20s by the name of Anthony. Anthony was pretty arrogant and obnoxious, but overall, he was a pretty cool guy. I used to kind of give him crap and tease him when it came to approaching the ladies because he always seemed timid or too aggressive. So yeah, I was and still am a ladies' man. I was being annoying to him. After working at this place for about 3 months, Anthony asked me if I would drop him off at home. It wasn't too far from the direction that I was heading, so I dropped him off maybe twice a week for the next month or so. Now, let me tell you, these car rides were quite uncomfortable. This guy, as much as we spoke at work, would not speak and just kind of stare straight the entire ride. It got to the point that his awkwardness went from entertaining to straight creepy. Fast forward 3 or 4 years later, I'm watching the news as they go into detail of a horrific crime committed by a Comcast installation worker. Apparently, he entered 2 homes that he was meant to do some installations in. He raped, beat, and strangled 2 women. The real unfortunate thing is this happened on 2 different occasions, and after the first murder, the gentleman was arrested and questioned but released and sent back to work, which allowed him to strike again. As a picture of his mugshot flashed on the screen, I froze. It was Anthony. Now, growing up on the south side of Chicago, I have grown up and befriended a fair share of people who grew up to be murderers, but this one really scared me. How my mother saved my father's life, or the meeting with the Kansas City butcher by Molly Biscotti. My father was a handsome young 20-something-year-old who lived in a half-sketchy area of Westport with my mother, and they were newly wedded, expecting their first child, my older brother, within a month. This was in the mid-80s, and my father was into the whole Robert Smith kind of look, with long dark hair, piercings, etc., and kind of sensitive or feminine looking. He had actually been mistaken as being gay before because of his looks. Anyway, on this particular night, my parents had been shopping around Westport on a street full of little boutique-style shops. My mum stepped into a shop to look around and my dad waited outside to smoke a cigarette. He said that a man came out of an adjacent store and struck up a conversation with him. The man was polite and friendly, but as the conversation continued, he became increasingly personal with his line of questions. Example, where do you live? Why don't you come over? Etc. My father was young and dumb, and so he grew up very trusting, and he was in a very small Kansas town, and being newly transplanted to this large city, he still gone on with the conversation. Just as it was getting really weird, my mother came out of the store, came up behind my father, and looped her arm around him. Like I said, my mum was heavily pregnant at this point. As soon as the other man saw my mum do this, he stopped what he was saying mid-sentence, turned around and walked back into the adjacent store without a word. They both thought it was odd because frankly my dad was glad to be away from the man, and he didn't know exactly why he felt so unsettled by him, and they continued shopping and went home. That man ended up being the Kansas City butcher, or Robert Verlinder. As an active serial killer in the Kansas City/Westport area, his MO was to lure gay guys into his home, rape and torture them, then kill them. He was caught a few weeks after his encounter with my father when a victim escaped from his home, fleeing down the street in only a dog collar. My dad highly suspects that he was in fact scoping him out to try and get him as a victim or something, but maybe when he saw my mum he realised he wasn't gay. Oh, and the shop he come out of, that was his shop, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, an oddity shop that displayed the skull of one of his victims in the window. Highway Assistance from a Serial Killer by Ravencrow. My mum told me about this story yesterday. The relationship to the person it happened to is as follows. The guy was my mum's friend's son's friend, if you can follow that. I don't know what the boy's name was, but for the sake of this story, I'll just call him John. John was driving through Sturbridge, MA, when he got a flat tyre. He pulled over and put on his hazard lights to change a tyre. He got it fixed, but by the time he was done, his hazard lights had drained the battery, so he was stuck. A car pulled over behind him and a man got out to offer to help. Neither of them had jump cables, so there was nothing the guy could do to help him. Yet, he didn't leave. He stuck around and started talking to John, asking him some really weird questions. One of the most distinctly remembered was him asking what John's religion was. John started to get really creeped out by this guy, and he tried to put his car between them. At that point, 2 police cars pulled over behind him. One of the police officers then told John that he had to back up, and he forcefully put his arm behind him, and then he told him to get back into his car, do up all the windows and lock the doors. It turned out they had run both license plates under their system, and the other guy was driving a stolen car. The police grabbed the man and literally slammed him against his car, putting cuffs on him. There was an APB out for his arrest. They went around to the back of his car and opened up the trunk. I excitedly said to my mum, "Was there a body in the trunk?" "No, but close," she told me. When they opened the trunk, they found a trap. Under the trap were a bunch of tools, including several pickaxes. My mum described them as dismemberment tools. It turned out that the guy had killed 15 people. The Man in the Yellow Raincoat by Wal Baboon. So this is a story that happened to my mum's friend in Korea like 10 years ago. Every time I hear this, I get chills. My mum's friend lived in an apartment complex in Seoul. She was a stay-at-home mother with a young daughter, and her husband worked during the days. One day, she was coming home from running errands with her daughter and got into an elevator in her building. When she got on, she noticed that there was a man wearing a cap and a yellow raincoat. He kept his head low, so she wasn't really able to see his face or anything. She immediately felt really uneasy, and she made her daughter stand to the side, furthest away from the guy. What made her feel even more uncomfortable was when she pressed a button for her floor, there was no other lit number, and on top of that, she noticed that he was carrying something wrapped inside a newspaper close to his side. Things started to click in my mum's head, and she started to panic and decided to call somebody on her cell phone, but she wasn't able to get through and pretended it was just her husband, who was obviously really not at home at the time, but she played it off that he was. She started saying stuff like, "Oh, I'm on the elevator about to get off, can you get the door for me?" Making it seem like her husband was actually at home waiting for her. When the elevator did reach the floor, I think she lived on the 12th floor or something too, she quickly got off and grabbed her daughter and started to walk as fast as she could to her apartment. She noticed that the man also got off on her floor and slowly started following her down the hallway. When my mum's friend finally got to the door, she started to bang on it and started shouting out her husband's name, saying, "I'm home, please open the door," and kind of pretended like he was coming to answer the door. Upon seeing this, the man in the yellow raincoat started to walk away, back towards the elevator. When he seemed to be far enough away, my mum's friend quickly picked up her daughter and slid open the door's passcode thingy. She then frantically started trying to punch in the key code, but the problem was that the buttons would make sound, so the man would know that nobody was going to answer the door to let her in, and he turned around and started to run back towards her. And my mum's friend at this point was practically screaming. When she finally got the door to open, the first thing she did was throw her daughter through the door. When she got herself in, she saw that the man was pretty much inches from the door, but she managed to shut it and lock it before he could wedge his hand or weapon into the door. Afterwards, looking through the peephole, she saw that the man was just walking casually away towards the elevator. Several months later, my mum's friend was watching the news and there was a coverage on a capture of a serial killer who used to kill a lot of prostitutes. She told my mum that she could never forget the dread she felt when she saw that all too familiar yellow raincoat. You never know who you're gonna run into. Now this didn't happen to me but my granddad many years ago. This is only short but nonetheless bone-chillingly terrifying. When my granddad was younger, he used to live in a very rural area where that everybody kind of knew each other. Where he lived was still very remote though, so you would either know people or you'd have no clue who they are, if that makes sense. And anytime there was anybody passing through, you would always get a little bit suspicious. My granddad at the time was relatively unaware of the dangers of other people because he was only about 16 at the time of this, but he was working on the farmland near his house, close to a slight wooded area. He had done most of his tasks for the day and was just relaxing by a small stream. As he was waiting there, he saw some splashing in the distance and thought maybe it was a hog or another wild animal. As he was waiting there, he heard some heavy, frantic breathing and realised that it was in fact a person. Now, being the very laid back and calm person that my granddad is, he just thought it was funny to see somebody frantically running up the stream towards him, looking almost crazy. So as he approached, he simply smiled and nodded at him, and the guy did it back to him. This did unsettle him a little though, finally, and he decided after a few minutes that there shouldn't have been any reason for somebody to be sprinting up that stream anyway, and headed back home. As he got back though, he was greeted by his parents explaining that the police were at his door. Apparently, at the time there was a huge manhunt on for a serial killer who was very loosely on the run from the police. So my granddad had seen somebody who had killed multiple people before running up the stream, could have easily done anything to my granddad, and what did he do? Smiled and nodded back at him. Hello everyone, thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe for my future content. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, then please leave them for me in the comments below. I really enjoyed making this video and I'm going to do a lot more like it. I'm going to be doing a lot more collabs soon too. They're just underway and take a little bit longer. But for the meantime, before they come out, I'm going to do a lot more content. I hope everybody's doing well, so yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Take care.